For our afternoon segment, we're going to be talking a little bit about groundwater sustainability, SGMA, and water perspectives. We have Ron Samuelian from Provo and Pritchard Consulting and Jason Pichu from Maricopa Orchards. Ron Samuelian is the president of Provost and Pritchard Consulting Group, which focuses on civil and agricultural engineering, hydrology, planning, environmental, and construction management. Ron's work in the Central Valley has been critical in better understanding groundwater basins as work begins on SGMA and recharge efforts. Jason is vice president of Business Affairs for Maricopa Orchards, a growing operation with a critically overdrafted, within a critically overdrafted basin. So Jason, I know you're short for time today and need to get out of here fairly soon, so why don't you go ahead and start off. You have them coming up automatically in magic fashion. And you should have the microphone right there. Yeah, I think that's Ron's.
We need the other one, Tony. No, the...
Hello, there we go. So I'll give an expanded background on myself. I'm Vice President of Business Affairs for Maricopa Orchards. It's a family farming operation that's a diversified farming company. We also do home development, real estate development. The family is starting a pharmacy school and a medical school in Fresno. We farm predominantly almonds, pistachios, some citrus, some walnuts, some raisins, blueberries, and cherries. The vast majority of the farming operations range from Fresno south to southern Kern County. So when Don reached out, he wanted perspective on SGMA and what impacts it has. When I joined the company, one of my main focuses originally was to help manage water across the group. Originally, we were in 15 different water districts, so I have the opportunity to see a lot of different perspectives and impacts in terms of what SGMA is doing and what it's going to do in the future. So this is just a bit of a perspective kind of on what I've seen. We're starting to see changing behaviors. And I mean, the most immediate one is growers are starting to become aware. I mean, 2 years ago, it was non-existent. No one really thought about it. With each passing year, I mean, it's becoming more and more prevalent. GSAs have been formed. They're doing, I would say most of them are doing a pretty good job of getting their growers educated. They're holding workshops, they're doing meetings, getting people up to speed. New acquisitions, I would say the water market is actually starting to evolve. And the basis for that is twofold. I mean, in southern Kern County, I saw districts that for the first time ever started purchasing water last year to bring in. And they're doing it for themselves because they're looking in the future saying, okay, we need to bank water so we have it for managing and basically smoothing that glide path for the implementation of SGMA. I mean, that's the type of behavior you want people to do. The other thing you see, I've seen this in the King Subbasin, is projects are already starting. So you have, whether you're in Kern County or the King Subbasin, I mean, one of the two advantages you have is when you have flooding rivers, is how do you take advantage of flood flows? And in the past, most people would just let the flood flows go past. Now there's actually projects being built and growers reaching out to water districts saying, we'll build recharge projects. Can you give us access to water? We'll sink it. And irrigation districts like Fresno Irrigation District, they're being approached by people that are on their borders that are outside of the district boundaries. They have growers within their boundaries saying, if we build projects, can we have access to water to sink it in credits? So those are the types of behaviors that you see that are adjusting, and all of that is what's going to be needed long term. The other thing that I would say that it's becoming prevalent is, I mean, there's a certain degree of uneasiness and uncertainty, and there's a variety of reasons for that, but the things that stand out of the gate, I mean, acres are going to come out of production. I mean, you hear different numbers up and down the state. I was at a meeting in Kern County a couple months ago, and I listened to Jason Phillips from the Friant Water Authority claim 1 million acres are coming out of production. You hear some people say 20% of the acres, 30% of the acres. I have a general view. I mean, something has to give. I mean, when we listen to the prior presenter say that you're 1.8 million acre feet in overdraft across the San Joaquin Valley, I mean, if that truly is the number annually, I mean, pick your consumptive use of whatever the number is and divide. If it's 3 acre feet, that's 600, sorry, I had to do the math in my head, 600,000 acres. I mean, if it's 2 acre feet, I mean, that's 900,000 acres. So 1 million may be too high, but 500,000 acres still seems like a lot of acres to me. Impacts on land valuation. I mean, we're a diverse company. I mean, we are constantly growing. It's a little bit different than the traditional, I mean, it's a family-run business, but we look at land deals up and down the valley. And the thing that's pretty prevalent is a lot of the listings that are coming on the market are listings that are in groundwater-only areas. So the impact of what that's going to be is unknown. So stuff sits on the market longer, especially when there's large stuff. I mean, you start looking at some of the private equity groups that are listing pistachio ranches that are $50 million that are in Tulare on groundwater only. I mean, it's a hard sale. If you can sell that, you earn your commission as a broker. So the other thing that's sitting out there is legal challenges. I mean, you have growers at different places that say different things. I mean, the Kern Groundwater Authority just published a paper that kind of outlined the different legal positions for groundwater. And it wasn't one way or another. It's just like these are kind of the different positions that are out there. Because people are afraid of, I mean, what's going to happen if, I mean, there are people facing, there's a lot at risk. So, I mean, that provides a lot of incentive to challenge it. So how do we navigate through that? The message that I try to convey when I'm going up and down the state is how do we work together to maintain as much ag just in general, regardless of what district you're in. I mean, you want to figure out is how do we maintain as many acres as possible, because it's what's best for the state. It's what's best for ag, and ultimately, I mean, it's what's best for the growers. The other issue we have is, I mean, ultimately there's increasing costs. I mean, every year as a grower or as a business owner, I mean, your costs go up. This is a little bit different. I mean, you're going to have GSA fees, whatever it is, if it's a volumetric per acre foot fee, if you're pumping. I mean, that's one cost. The larger costs are carrying costs. Most farms aren't used to carrying open land just for the sake of water. I mean, that's not a normal practice. The only place I would say that's relatively normal, unfortunately, is Westlands. And that's been because of water shortages, not because of groundwater pumping restrictions. So that's going to impact carrying costs. Let's see if I can figure out how to move them. Oh, there we go. So the thing that I wanted to look at were the ripple effects of implementation. I mean, everybody's at the very early stages of, okay, GSAs are formed, now we're forming groundwater sustainability plans. Whether it costs $500,000 or $1 million, it's a lot of money. You have all the technical components that go into it, but the part that's missed, if you take a step back and look, I mean, ultimately, it's going to be regionalized as well. It's just like beneficial use. It's going to vary depending on what county you're in, what subbasin you're in, and what GSA you happen to be in within each subbasin. They're not all going to be equal. So the implications of the impacts of lost jobs, acres coming out of production, property tax reductions is going to vary from subbasin to subbasin. I mean, when I looked briefly at CDFA's webpage, I mean, you look at the top 3 counties, pretty much are either Kern, Tulare, or Fresno, 1, 2, 3. And my guess is that you're going to see a shakeup in those 3 over the next 20 years as Sigma rolls out. just because the implications of acres coming out of production, and it's going to vary between those three counties in terms of which one's going to be impacted the most to least. So that's looking at it from a sub-basin and county standpoint. The second thing you look at is not all crops are equal. So first you start with the basin. I mean, some basins are just naturally, they have more water than others. So when you look at, Ron will speak to it, but the Kings sub-basin with the Kings River has a lot more water coming through it, plus it has a flooding Kings River than the Kern sub-basin. That puts Kern in a tough position. You have a flooding Kern River, but it's a larger sub-basin than the King sub-basin, and it doesn't flood as much. So, I mean, you're kind of balancing that. So now as you're a grower within each of these places, you have to figure out which crops are going to make it and which ones aren't. I mean, ultimately, just like in South Africa, I mean, the permanent crops, people are going to do everything they can to maintain it. I mean, if you're investing $10,000 plus to bring a nut tree to production, ignore table grapes. I mean, table grapes is a whole nother level when you look at the cost of the trellis systems. I mean, people are going to do everything they can to protect that. So those acres will most likely stay in production longer. Plus, they tend to be higher value. And if there's a credit system or the ability to buy additional surface water supplies, they'll do it. Row crops, I mean, this is one of the areas I get concerned with. I grew up on a small farm, family grows cotton, processing tomatoes. Professionally, I started working for a large farm on the west side in Westlands, and processing tomatoes was one of the main crops. And I mean, ultimately, when you look at Westlands, Westlands is a good, if I was going to pick a canary in the gold mine or in the coal mine, and for Sigma, it's Westlands. And the reason for that is the number of acres that are out of production due to drought kind of is a glimpse of what the future of ag in California is going to look like. Just going to be a different reason. It's not because of allocation reductions, it's because of groundwater pumping restrictions. But you're going to have this variability of this mix of open land with permanent crops. I mean, you compare Westlands with, say, Madera County. I mean, Madera County's planted wall to wall with almonds and grapes. I mean, it's not necessarily in any better water position. They just happen to have more groundwater, but they're in severe overdraft. So, I mean, that's going to change. So what ends up happening is if there's a credit system in place, growers are going to have to make a decision. Do I plant processing tomatoes or melons or onions or garlic or whatever the crop is, or do I save those credits for my trees, vines, whatever the crop is? So the potential impact is, I think, going to be difficult on the processing tomato industry. I mean, people say it could shift north up into the Sacramento Valley, but I mean, there's 260,000 acres of tomatoes grown in the state, and you can't move all of them up into the Sacramento Valley. I mean, you're still going to need some. The flip side of that, hopefully the positive side, is the pricing on it hopefully comes up to a level where it's competitive, where people have an option where it becomes a viable option to grow row crops, whether it's onions, garlic, tomatoes, versus investing in trees. Tomatoes are something that you use transplants. I mean, you're making a decision in December on whether or not to plant. So when the Bureau of Reclamation holds off until February to make an allocation or waits until March, I mean, it's too late. I mean, you're out of luck. So in the future, if you're having to decide, do I plant or do I not plant? I mean, you're not going to plant. You're going to save that credit because it's not worth the risk. So what that's going to do is unknown. Dairy and feed crops is the third thing I have on this list. I mean, for a couple of years when I look at it, I mean, the feed crop rotation, so take your pick, wheat followed by corn, or triticale followed by corn, or just alfalfa straight that's used for feed at dairies. I mean, it takes, whether you're double cropping or planting alfalfa, you're probably applying somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 acre-feet per acre in a year. It's a lot of water. So the impact is going to be pretty strong. And a lot of dairies tend to be in a couple different places. There's a lot of dairies in the state that are in very water-rich areas, and there's also a lot of dairies that rely solely on groundwater, and that's going to be tough. The flip side of that is most of the dairy market's tough. I'm by no means an expert in dairy. But when commodity prices for milk drop, the one thing that generally keeps them afloat is the dairies that can produce their own feed. So the feed crops basically become the equivalent of a permanent crop for a dairy. So they have to maintain the acres. So they may have to go out and buy additional water or additional land to keep fallow. I'd never thought of it in that light, but I actually listened to a dairyman from Merced describe it that way a year ago. So moving forward, as we're managing Sigma, I mean, how do we do it? What do we learn? And the first thing that I look at, it's not any different than running our businesses day in and day out. You learn from experience. So when I talk about experience in the water world in general, there's no experience like today. So 2017 was historic rainfall. Basically, it was a combination of two winters combined into one. Fast forward into 2018, I mean, you're immediately back to where you began. The thing that I've always loved so much about farming is every year is completely different. And how do you adjust to it? The thing that I love about water, every year is completely different. But the one thing that I would say differs between water and farming, just production in general, is production ag is an annual change. Like from year to year, you're kind of adjusting to the changes. In the water world, it changes every single month. And the first thing that I would say is we have to learn from experience in terms of transfers, markets, banking, et cetera. Having the ability to take advantage of different situations in the water world up and down the state is something that has to be streamlined. You have place of use rules. I mean, you have state water project place of use, you have federal place of use. Water can't go from one place to the other without a petition for a change in place of use. All of this stuff has to be done early in the year. It's pretty complicated. There's limitations in terms of what Bureau allows you to do, what State Water Project allows you to do, what the actual individual irrigation districts will allow you to do. The main point that I raise here is you have to have flexibility. I mean, the thing that I try to figure out is to be as proactive as possible so that we can take advantage of it. I mean, we do groundwater banking both directly and indirectly in Kern County. When we start managing properties in Westlands, how are we going to manage it long term? So ultimately, anything that can be done to eliminate red tape, to basically increase the efficiency of water market and the ability to move water across the state is going to be an advantage for everybody. So even if it's one person can't benefit from it, I mean, a controversial project is a semi-tropic project that's at the end of the Kings River. I mean, at one point, a lot of people don't like it. They want to capture it and put it into the aqueduct and send it down south. I mean, the way that I view it in general is it's at the very end of the river. I mean, if they don't want to flood Corcoran and there's no other place for water to go, and every district upstream is going to be putting straws in that glass to capture the floodwater. And if there's still water left, if it benefits ag, it's something that's beneficial for the state. It's a huge gamble, though, because it is a huge project that costs a ton of money. I mean, if somebody's willing to take that bet, I mean, they're basically putting a stake in the ground with no guarantees of water. And that's kind of the decisions that districts are trying to make. And it's for their own livelihood. They're trying to protect their growers. The next thing I have on here is early credit system framework. One of the common themes that's being talked about up and down the state is how do you generate water credits? So the concept there, again, is I'm not going to run my wells, and I'm going to save those credits for a future date in a dry period. If there's some framework, and no one has figured out how to do that yet. There was a gentleman kind of going up and down the state from the University of Adelaide a couple of years ago showing how Australia built their water credit system. But no one's very far down the road in terms of what that's going to look like. But there are growers out there, ourselves being one of them, that would look at it as a management tool of how do you reduce, if you reduce pumping now to generate credits that you can use later, I mean, there's folks that will do that. The other thing in terms of early credit system is it would dictate whether or not people would be willing to buy surface water in different situations. So Last year was an anomaly. I mean, you basically had 2 winters combined into one. This year, we're basically back down into drought situations where water's expensive again. I'm talking about situations more along the lines where you're in the middle allocation-wise. I mean, when you end up in that point, people are going to have to start making decisions of, I mean, Kern County banked, I don't know, I was trying to pull it up. I think they banked 900,000 acre-feet this year in the Kern Water Bank, something like that. And I mean, the average price of that water was probably minimal. What I'm saying is in the future, you may have people willing to buy water at $100, $200 an acre foot to bank in those in-betweens for managing instead of pumping. But you have to have some type of framework in place to where they have credits for that. Otherwise, it's an economic decision. I mean, one of the challenges that I saw up and down the state again last year is, I mean, you had 100% allocation in Westlands. There was, they rescheduled, after the rescheduling guidelines that the Bureau of Reclamation allowed, they lost roughly, I think it was 260,000 acre feet of water spilled and became part of New Year allocation. Yet, growers across the district still pumped, I think, 40,000 acre feet. And I saw that same thing in Madera. I saw it in Kern County. And it's an economics decision. I mean, if it costs $100 less to pump an acre foot, people are going to say, okay, I need 1,000 acre feet. I'm saving $100. $100,000 is a lot of money. But if there's some type of credit system that goes forward, I mean, you'll eliminate that sort of stuff. And it's just not quite there. And people are doing what they need to stay in business. The next thing I would put on is just money. Don touched on this briefly when he asked DWR. Grants, raising fees from GSAs. I mean, the raising fees from GSAs is going to be there. The concept I look at is there some mechanism for grants that can help incentivize the construction of recharge projects? And it's going to vary because you have to have surface water in places, and there's also limitations in terms of, I'm not an engineer or a hydrogeologist, is that right? Yeah. But you have clay layers, you have some areas that, I mean, does the groundwater, I mean, if you put water, does it actually go down? Does it reach the aquifer? Is it in the confined zone? Is it in the unconfined zone? I mean, there's a lot of mechanics that go into it. But when you think about the incentives for Air District, I mean, one of the successful programs that was implemented by the San Joaquin Valley Air Pollution Control District was getting people to roll over booster pumps, stationary well engines, et cetera, getting rid of the old tier 0, tier 1, tier 2 type engines and then tractors, et cetera. That same type of structure is something that could be there that if you're a grower and you're building a reservoir for irrigation saying, hey, why don't you build it an extra, double the size of it so we can sink water in it. And in some districts, people are being progressive and they're actually doing that today with no incentives. But the goal is you want that in as many places as possible. And we've talked about this at Fresno Irrigation District because within each subbasin, one of the biggest challenges you have, I mean, again, you have varying geology throughout the subbasin. And the more places you have to sink water, the easier it is to manage if there's any negative impacts in a specific spot. So I'll give an example to that is if groundwater is dropping below your, what's the proper term for your threshold, minimum threshold in one area. I mean, are you out of compliance because of that one area if 90% of the district is okay? I mean, that's the question. The more recharge basins you have, the better off you are. So having grants available for building recharge projects, monitoring wells, any of that sort of stuff is going to only increase the early adoption. And it's the same thing. You basically load it up on the front end to get people to do it early. Don't wait 15 years to make it available. Make it available where people do it early and then take it away. The other thing I look at is just flexibility in groundwater sustainability plans. And the biggest thing that I look at with that is time. I don't know if the State Water Resources Control Board is still here, but I mean, that is one of those things that is a fear up and down the state is the state's gonna step in and they're gonna just cap it and make it even across the board and all that sort of stuff. And I mean, people are actively trying to do this. They're trying, we need time to collect the data gaps where there's not information. But from a farmer's perspective, I mean, the thing that I need is a clear framework and timeline for implementation. I mean, ultimately, we're making decisions, when we're planting an almond orchard, I mean, that's a 25-year decision. If we're planting a pistachio orchard, that's a 50-plus year decision. And how much do you have? And that's one of those things that makes today such a challenging environment. I mean, I do analysis every year across all of the GSAs, all of our main districts, trying to figure out what are the risk levels. And the risk that I bring, and I make sure to note it to the family, is it's only as good as the assumptions we agree upon. I mean, if I'm off on allocation, or if I'm off on what the Sigma groundwater credits are going to be, we're either going to be overplanted or underplanted. And that's a really tough position to be in when you're trying to make 10, 20-year plus decisions. The other thing I have on here is just economic and market approach. We are a firm believer in this. I mean, ultimately, farmers are resilient. They will figure out how to manage it, but you have to have tools in the tool chest in order to do it. And that's what, again, with the South Africa, people look at it and say, okay, it is a good template of something we need to be careful of. But they're pumping, what are they relying on to get through it? They're drilling a whole bunch of wells. That's the one tool that people have had for managing volatility and water supply in the South San Joaquin Valley, and that's going away. So now you're raising the stakes in terms of what it's going to be for that volatility. So ultimately, if there's Sigma credits, we can manage through it. But it is probably one of those things that I've seen the transition. I grew up on a family farm. I started working on a farm when I was 10. And the number of families that I see getting out of farming is increasing each year. And these aren't necessarily small farms. These are large farming operations. They're just saying it's getting more and more complex. And most folks don't have the level of sophistication that, it's just growing by the year. So the last thing I have is just kind of a practical guide. This is just this could be applied to any district anywhere in the state. I based it on South of Delta CVP. I assumed a 1,200 acre farm, 300 acres of almonds, a quarter or 150 acres of pistachios, and then 300 acres of row crops, both tomatoes and processing onions, and then 450 acres of dryland wheat or fallow. I plugged in the estimated water budget numbers. So in this instance, you have a 1,200 acre farm that's 38% planted to permanent crops, 25% row crops, and basically 40% fallow. 100% allocation for this ranch would be for Westlands. I don't have it in here, sorry. But it basically shows you, let's start on the right. If you look at the allocations, does this have a pointer? No. You look at the historical allocations on the right. Those are south of Delta. The drought 2014, 15, 16, 0%, 0%, 5%. Again, South Africa was talking about allotment cuts to 50 to 60%. We're trying to figure out how to manage that. All right, well, we just managed, let's go back to 2013. 20%, 0%, 0%, 5%, and we got 100%, and then 20% is the initial allocation so far for right now. That is a difficult world to operate in. And if you take away the ability to to pump groundwater, that is the issue. So one of the things that is needed in GSPs is that flexibility. Like, you have to be able to make it through drought periods. And whether it's drought periods or restrictions due to cold water pool. Whatever the reason for the lack of availability in a given time period, people need flexibility to get through it. So when you look at the averages, so the 5-year average is 25%, 10-year average is a 32% allocation, and I always go back to 2006 because that was prior to last year. That was the last 100% allocation for South of Delta CVP, so 40%. So let's look at our example on the left. So if we use a 40% allocation, you're getting 1,200 acre feet of surface water allocation. The budget from the prior page was 2,625 acre feet, so you're short 1,425 acre feet. That works out to 1.19 acre feet per acre. So that either needs to be some combination of the purchase of additional surface water to bring in, the carry forward of pumping credits, or just kind of an annual credit of what it is. And up and down the state, kind of just a general rule of thumb is it's a half acre foot or less. Do you agree with that? Probably, yeah. I mean, ballpark. And ultimately, you're looking at long-term averages because, I mean, you don't want anything to be based on a single year because it'll be a jigsaw. You'll be up, down, up, down, up, down. You need to have some rolling period of time. That's another thing that I would advocate. So you're not making abrupt changes from year to year based on hydrology. You need, I would say, a minimum of 3 years, ideally 5-year rolling averages, and if possible, 10. But, I mean, whether or not that's realistic, I don't know. I'm not sure what the DWR would approve. But if the long-term average is 40% for the next 10 years, the point here is you can't support it. It doesn't work. And that's based on again, 40% of the land is fallow. I mean, that's basically reality in Westlands today. That is not reality in Kern County. It's not reality in Kings Subbasin. It's not reality in Madera Subbasin, Chowchilla Subbasin, Tulare or Tule. So, again, managing water is basically balancing a checkbook. And most folks haven't done the math in terms of what it is, but the neighborhood of 500,000 to 1 million acres, I mean, it's somewhere in there. And it's going to, just in conclusion, I mean, it's going to vary. It's not going to be even across the state. It will be highly regionalized. And the impacts are going to be, they're going to be hard on some farms, families, jobs, counties, et cetera. So hopefully I didn't go too long. Oh, I talked a long time. I'm sorry.
Well, Jason, since you need to get out of here right now, fairly quickly.
Yeah, I can take some questions.
Why don't we have questions for Jason and then
my apologies. I have to be in Fresno at 3 for a meeting. I'm hitchhiking.
He was daring enough to fly up with me. He's going to fly back with somebody else.
I wasn't sure getting in the plane with Dawn. I prefer to drive, but I made it here.
I'm going to bother again with my same Community Reinvestment Act and the banks. The model in urban areas is that to build infrastructures for long-term projects it's under Community Reinvestment Act from banks. You said grants, you said infrastructure. Have you approached banks to do this type of grants? Because they're looking into this funding that comes out of the banks is for building and rebuilding regional areas. And there's models for that in urban area. I mean, I've been pushing for the rural areas, but somehow in the middle of the country, Kansas and Illinois and all of them, they use this model, but we don't use it in California. And I will talk to you if you want off the line, but somehow we keep leaving that on the side, the banks coming to our rural areas with that pocket of monies that are for rebuilding rural areas.
We haven't looked at that yet. I mean, ultimately, all projects in general, I mean, the GSAs actually can't start acting as GSAs until 2020. So the ability to implement fees, the ability to raise money, I mean, some of that sort of stuff, it hasn't really kicked in yet. Mm-hmm. But moving forward, I mean, the first thing is identifying, I mean, just like a farm, when you're looking at a community, whether it's rural or urban, you have to understand what the total supply versus the demands are. I mean, is it needed? Mm-hmm. Some places it may be needed, other places it won't. Mm-hmm. For instance, I mean, when you have a small community within Westlands, like Huron, I mean, they have a contract, a CVP contract that they get as an M&I allocation. Does that match what their demands are, or do they need additional? Do they do groundwater for the balance? Where do they get it from? And that same thing would apply if you were looking at communities in Fresno County. I mean, whether it's Selma, Fowler, one of those places. How do they do it? They may have to build recharge basins to sink water to pump groundwater. That's what the city of Fresno does.
Yeah, thank you.
Go ahead, Nancy. You want to go first?
So thank you very much. I'm wondering if you're familiar with the report that came out a couple weeks ago out of Merced, UC Merced. The researcher was Tapan Patak.
I'm not familiar with it off the top of my head.
Okay, ran in the LA Times, very chilling, a 30-year projection on what crops we're actually going to be able to maintain in California. Just wanted your...
So the big concern we have in general, I mean, there's two things that I think of. I mean, it was also touched on this morning is climate change and impact on snowpack. I mean, the areas that get hit the hardest with that, like the state water project, the thing, he talked about change in average temperature. Another way to think of it is change in snowpack or snow level elevation. And I've heard that in the past where basically if the snow level elevation increases by 1,000 feet, so if on average it was 7,000 and now becomes 8,000, what percentage of snowpack is impacted? And it's substantial for the state water project around Orville. My guess is it's probably similar for the federal side. So that's an area of concern that we have. There's not much we can do about that. The other area of concern we have is prior to 2014-15, the concept of necessary chill hours needed for certain crops wasn't really thought of. 2015, when there's no pistachios on a tree up and down the state, all of a sudden people wake up. Across the industry, I think I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, it was 250 million pounds, something like that, not very many. I mean, that's another industry that has to deal with huge variability in supply. So, I mean, you go from 250 million pounds to 700 million pounds. I mean, that's a big swing when you're dealing with exports and that sort of stuff. So for us personally, the concern with climate change would be impact on chill for pistachios and cherries. And cherries basically require the same thing. So we'll start harvesting cherries in a month or so. And if there's no cherries on a tree, that's not a good outlook for pistachios.
The report also was very cautious about stone fruit and where we'd be able to grow peaches, apricots.
Which makes sense. I mean, peaches is it's basically the same family as an almond. But I'm not as familiar with stone fruit. But there are thresholds for, an almond is less sensitive than a pistachio to chill, but an almond is more sensitive to salt. So depending on where you're growing things. So each crop, depending on what you pick, it's kind of like pick your poison, which challenge you want to try to manage.
I liked your concept on credit systems. I think it promotes good management. It promotes conservation. I think it's precautionary. But do you think that can be done on a GSA basis or on a basin-wide, regional or statewide? Do you think there needs to be some legislative effort to promote that, or how would you see that implemented so that it's done effectively and not as opportunistically, but give an opportunity to multiple regions or.
So the most effective way would be you would do it on a basin. Well, Ron could probably touch on it also, but I would suggest basin, because each basin, it's going to vary. Some basins is one GSA, like Westlands is the West Side Subbasin. The King Subbasin has seven GSAs. So there's a lot of complexity to that in terms of how do you do it, because one of the things that you run into is the ability to shift those credits from one area to the other. You can't shift the negative impacts of it. So you don't want to inadvertently shift all pumping to one part of a specific basin, because then you can cause negative impacts there. So it has to be within the basin itself. So there's different mechanisms for how to do it, but I mean, ultimately, those are the types of ideas where you need flexibility to figure out what works and what doesn't work. I mean, one of the things that I'm careful of is when I'm talking with GSAs is not to be too restrictive, basically to box us in a corner out of the gate, because you're trying to figure out how do you manage it. I mean, that's one of those things where I talk about the ripple effects. Like, you may do something today and the impacts of it you don't recognize what impacts it's going to have until later. The flip side of that, the other challenge with it is, I mean, you'll hear certain people say, okay, let's start with 1 acre-foot per acre. Well, you can't start high and then let the credits carry, because otherwise people accumulate too many. So it's not a simple thing. Figuring out how to structure that, if you can figure it out, Ron's hiring. Is that fair?
I just wanted to, so I understand what you're saying about doing it on a basin-wide basis, but how do you manage that if you bring transferred water in, say, from the North State to the south, south of the Delta?
So ultimately, I mean, depending on how it's structured, I mean, anytime surface water is brought in, I mean, at that point, you're saving the credits. I mean, if there's a credit system in place because you're not running a well. I mean, so that's something that, I mean, we're specifically interested in because, I mean, we bank groundwater. I have the ability to move water around that's a little bit different than some folks. And, I mean, we don't want to be negatively penalized for buying water, especially if we pay more for it and sink it and then bring it into a sub-basin. You don't want to lose the credits. So working through what that framework is, I mean, that's another example of time. I mean, everyone's going to work, everyone's going to spend $1 million, submit a pile of GSPs to DWR to sort through. And we're going to have to figure out, there's going to be a lot of good ideas. There's a lot of consulting firms, there's a lot of minds working on this of what works and what doesn't. And then we have to start figuring out which ones work so other people can adopt if necessary. The flip side of it is you have to get everyone to agree. I mean, before you can get to that point, you have to agree to what the storage change, is that right? Storage change, not overdraft, storage change. So it's figuring out what that number is step one. I mean, because everyone has to agree to that, and then you can figure out the framework for how to manage credits and that sort of stuff. The biggest thing I look at is most folks are, that's where I touched on the changing behaviors. I mean, people are bringing in surface water in Kern County. Like, they're actively going out to buy it. They're actively paying more water for buying it. Folks off the Kings River are trying to capture it now, where in the past they just let flood flows go by. I mean, so up and down the state, like, the behavior is changing. And that's before they even really go into effect. So we're going in the right direction. It's just prior to 2017, most of the groundwater banks down in Kern County were getting precipitously low. And one of the districts we were in, I'm like, you're flying towards a mountain. You have to make a decision of whether or not you want to pull up. Like, how long a runway do you want? And that's kind of the way that you look at Sigma also. You want a runway. And for growers, if you have a runway, you can manage towards it. So my ride is waiting for me at the airport. Is there any other questions? He's not going anywhere.
I'm sure we could go on. There is no doubt. But thank you again. I appreciate you coming.
My apologies for having to sneak out early.
Ronnie, you're up.
This is on? Okay. Abby's going to pull up the slide. Well, thanks for the opportunity to be here. Great to follow Jason. We didn't compare notes, but we've got a lot of similar thoughts and recommendations towards the end. I don't have a big PowerPoint presentation. I brought a couple maps. I've started my career at Fresno Irrigation District. Not a grower, didn't come from a grower family, so I'm learning all the time. Someday I'll have that almond orchard I want, but or pistachios or something, we'll see. But I'm learning a lot about Sigma. That's where I'm spending a lot of my time of late, and have had the privilege to work in the Kings Basin most of my career, but also now of late, the last couple years, working to coordinate the 7 GSAs we have that have developed. So my perspective today will be a little bit more of the effort and energy going into coordination over the next 18 months to 2 years and a little bit beyond. And Jason was a good segue. We have, I think everyone knows plans, the GSPs are due January of 2020, but of course we have 20 years to reach sustainability. It is interesting, I've heard DWR comment, maybe we should have given the people that were the most highly overdrafted a little more time till 2022 instead of the less overdrafted, but that is proving to be a challenge. A lot of effort and energy is going in, as I'm sure you're all aware and involved with. In the Kings, to highlight, we have 7 GSAs. We're bounded by the north, or into the north by the San Joaquin River, and then the Kings River cuts kind of through the eastern portion. So we sit between 2 major riverways, have a great interstream fan. It's an amazing aquifer, particularly to the east. And we have significant water supplies that come in. We bring in almost 1.2 million acre feet of surface water into the basin. It's about 1 million acres, mostly largely permanent cropping, vines and trees. Our demands hit over 2.5 million acre feet. And even with all that water we bring in, we are estimating, we call it storage change, you can call it overdraft if you want, but over a longer term base period, historically, since the 60s, the basin has talked about an overdraft of 120 to 150,000 acre feet. When you work through the GSPs, you want to look at a more recent time period that reflects some more recent cropping patterns. We think that number in the basin is just north of 200,000 acre feet, which compared to many areas, we mentioned Kern, I've heard numbers like 600 and plus down there. Others may know more, but it's still a significant number to fix within the Kings. I think SGMA is misnamed. The Sustainable Groundwater Management Act really was the Water Supply Act. In my mind, because although it doesn't affect surface water rights, it's very clear the separation of the haves and the have-nots in terms of surface water. So I think if we step back and don't just talk about groundwater, which everyone that's into it isn't anymore, we know that it's really a surface water or a water supply act. I mentioned 1.2 million acre feet of surface water that comes into the Kings on an average annual basis. It's probably better off than most, and so Kings, I've said it before, if we can't fix it in the Kings, I'm not sure we can fix it anywhere. I don't know if that's fully true, but I think we can do it, and we will, but it is still going to be a lot of effort. We have, in the Kings, it's just important to compare, and I hear this a lot from folks that apply different things. Jason's perspective is always good because he works in so many different GSAs. One size doesn't fit all, not throughout the state, of course, but even within a basin and even within a GSA. We have GSAs in the Kings that probably are really sustainable now. We certainly have portions of GSAs that are. We have a range of surface water that comes into the Kings from maybe as high as over 2 acre feet per acre to virtually 0. And I think it's critical that, I think everyone knows, DWR is requiring that the basin as a whole coordinate efforts. The whole basin has to present a solution. So it's forcing, as I think you all know, a lot of collaboration and coordination, call it negotiation, with neighbors that maybe dealt a little bit with each other but didn't before, because as we've been understanding, the message is the whole basin needs to breach sustainability. So our boundaries don't line up with the Kings, the sub-basin boundaries don't match up with where surface water goes, where political boundaries are. We're pretty fortunate in the Kings that we're not split too much, but I know many other basins that are split. It just goes to show that, you know, with the requirement to coordinate a basin, there is a recognition, and I've seen it amongst the GSAs. They all have to work together and they realize it. And it's been a good collaborative group. They're taking it very seriously. There's just a lot to do. I do think over the next 18 months or so, really, I should note a timeline. most people that we're dealing with in our firm recognize that while January 2020 is the deadline, about this time next year, most GSPs better be done to allow time for rolling those GSPs out to talk with stakeholders about here's what we're thinking. Because if you aren't as familiar with the law, our understanding of what's required is you're not going to put a GSP out that says we think we might go do these things. You have to have the first rollout of your plan saying we're going to do this. Maybe it's the first 5 years or 10 years of your plan, and we think it's going to cost X, so stakeholders, here's what we're asking for. And that needs to be justified and, of course, presented to those stakeholders for approval. So to think you're going to do that in a month or 2 months is not realistic. And many people are working to try and plan on 6 months, so June timeframe for rollout, so that June of next year. And I'm not sure that's adequate. So the time crunch is very real, and it is going to be very hard to get there. One of the, but I would say within the Kings, it's been a very positive effort, and I hope you hear that from me today, that the Kings is doing well, or pretty well. But I would encourage, one of the messages is I think, while nothing unites like a common enemy, it's good that there are the threat or the worry of I'll say at a state level coming in and doing things if others don't. I think it's critical that the local solutions be pushed and support efforts continue. One of the coordination efforts that has really been a significant effort in the Kings is understanding the size of the problem, but then also divvying up the problem. And that's where the one-size-fits-all doesn't come into play. It's nice. We have 1 million acres. We could take 200,000 acre-feet and just divide it by that and say, everyone just cut back to 2/10 of an acre-foot per acre. That's a possible solution. I floated that out. Fortunately, I still have a job, but it's not realistic, and it's not something anyone thinks would really fly. There's been a lot of effort doing that, and I think it's important to recognize that every GSA has to have a target of what's the size of the problem because of what I mentioned. That GSPs have to have a number that they're shooting for. And I think Jason alluded to it. We talked a lot about flexibility, and I've heard DWR say this. These first versions of GSPs, they're not going to be right. It's version 1.0. We need them to be complete. It needs to be the best estimate we possibly can have. Some GSAs are going to want to err extremely conservative, and others will not. But we do not have enough information. One of the biggest factors throughout the state, the biggest thing that goes into estimating it is how much groundwater do we pump. Everywhere is an estimate. We do not know those actual numbers. So we're going to be collecting data for a long time, and it's fortunate we have a number of years to work that through. It's not a simple exercise, as we mentioned. I would note in the Kings, amongst many of the possible solutions, and we heard about land retirement and fallowing. I mean, it's supply and demand, obviously, but groundwater recharge is going to be a critical part of the solution in the Kings. The Kings has, as a subbasin, really it's held obviously by districts and groups that have water rights. But Jason mentioned those, in theory, floodwaters, even though in the Kings it's fully appropriated. Those waters that have been used or unused will no longer go unused. And those folks that have those water rights are going to do everything they can to protect them and put them to use. Clearly within the Kings Basin, and within any basin, you're going to focus on your constituency first. So you understand multiple agencies underneath these GSAs, they're going to focus on themselves first. Once they're whole, then they'll probably go to, okay, the GSA as a whole. Once the GSA is whole, then we'll look at how do we solve the basin. And that's playing out everywhere. So that just takes a lot of time, and the push for credits and mitigation is a great conversation. The problem we're seeing is those that are likely in the place to be issuing the credits or have the availability want to know for sure that they're going to be able to take care of their constituency first, and that makes sense. So it is going to take a while before we play it out. But I would encourage this group and any group. I've been working with Groundwater Recharge and banking, designed and built a number of banks over the years. It is paramount. We all recognize in the state that groundwater recharge is beneficial. We depend on it, urban, ag, you name it, we all depend on it. We need to recognize groundwater recharge as a beneficial use. It needs to be identified because it will be critical moving forward with all of the GSAs, and particularly in the Kings. It's an opportunity with good sandy soils. I would note, the other thing I'd highlight is, Jason, I sound like doomsday here. I don't like to do that, but Jason mentioned areas without water supply. We have that within the Kings, areas that haven't received surface water in the past, and they're looking to do projects to capture available water when it's there. But that is not an insignificant cost, maybe $200 an acre, plus the water supply. And firming that up is not insignificant. So there's a lot to that. I would just note, maybe we can, does this go to the next slide? Maybe? Oh, I messed it up. Okay, that's a little blurry, sorry. You see the Kings Basin there. We talked about, I focused a lot on sort of the internal coordination. As part of the Sigma and the GSP development, obviously, whatever we set internal into our basin, our neighbors are going to be concerned about, as we are with them. And we do have impacts from pumping by our neighbors within the Kings. So in the Kings alone, let alone coordinating 7 GSAs, and I know there's other basins with more, we have 5 basins we neighbor and 12 GSAs amongst those basins. And coordinating with each of them and individually is just taking a lot of effort. What's the coordination? Well, if we have an overdraft of 200,000 acre feet, if that ends up being our number, how much is caused by the neighbor and how much have we caused them? We have to come to some sort of an agreement on that. And that's taking a lot of effort. So that's critical, the coordination. I guess I'd end with, I know there's lots of challenges ahead, but I'd highlight, Don, when he asked me, he says, well, you can ask for a few things of the board or encourage them to do a few things. And I would say there's 4. And our list with Jason was we didn't talk, but it's pretty consistent. I would continue to encourage local control. Locals need to push for that, and I think that's critical. I would, second, I would suggest that folks assist and encourage efforts that will increase operational flexibility and surface water supply. We heard that from Jason loud and clear, and I think that's important. How can we move the water around where we need to? Again, we have lots of overlapping requirements, but I think when we look back in 2040, it'll look a lot different as to how we are able to use water throughout basins in the state. 3, I would say, how do we insist and encourage groundwater recharge as a beneficial use? I highlighted that. And then, of course, 4, it would be support future state funding efforts that will assist GSAs with projects and programs for implementation. There is going to be a heavy burden. There's no kidding around this, that ag is going to bear the heavy burden of Sigma, and there's going to be significant costs, and we need to figure out ways to keep that an active part and significant part of our economy. That's my thoughts.
Thank you, Ron. We'll go ahead and open it up for questions. Bryce?
Well, that last one, I like that list of 4. You know, there's going to be a bond on the November ballot, and it'll have 500, I think 550 million for GSP implementation. And so I'd like to work with you on making sure that that water bond passes. The question I have for you, and maybe I had a couple, and I should limit it to one and then come back, Dawn. How would you describe the differences between water banking and recharging aquifer? I believe in both, but I think sometimes I want to go recharge aquifers. Water banks seem to me to be very specific as far as banking water for certain types of use, and an aquifer recharge seems much more broad base in benefiting a larger area, but the water bank, I think, is much more able to take risk and handle things in an in and out type basis, where a recharging is challenging because who gets the benefit? How would you respond to the idea of water banks versus general recharge?
Sure, and I'll start out with you didn't mention it, and I probably shouldn't mention it, but one term I've heard over my career that I wish would just go away, so I don't know why I'm bringing it up, but artificial recharge was a term that was used forever, and I hate that word artificial. So recharge is, I would classify, to answer your question, the difference is generally the bank projects control the pumping, where recharge, we're putting it in the ground, and whether it's an irrigation district that puts it in the ground and there are wells from growers and cities nearby that pull it out, fine. If it's individually as a grower that pulls it, or individually the bank operator pulls it out for some use, whether it's exchange or delivery downstream, maybe that's a simplified definition. But they do take all different forms. And I think most of the banks I've worked on, or all of the banks I've worked on, always have a leave behind recharge component. So there's always some dedicated amount of recharge that's occurring right near the site and benefiting the neighbors adjacent to the spreading grounds.
So were you here for when Eric spoke from the State Water Board?
I was not.
Okay. So we asked him this question about beneficial use because it's been a hot topic about groundwater recharge being a beneficial use in and of itself. And his statement was that he doesn't think it's actually needed because by putting that water, recharging and putting it in the ground, you are doing it for some beneficial use reason. It might be for future agricultural use. It might be to keep a surface water, groundwater connection. It might be to keep water levels at a height that domestic wells aren't going to be threatened to go dry, so that there actually isn't a need. And then he believes that there may be unintended consequences of designating as a beneficial use for junior rights holders that are downstream. So can you maybe speak to why, if that makes sense to you, or whether you think actually there's situations where that's not enough and so you really do need that designation?
Yeah, I wish I was here. I'm sorry, I got caught on the 99 coming up. But no, I probably need to defer to understand a little bit more. Not a water attorney. I've only really dealt with one water rights application. Mm-hmm. And I know in dealing with that, there was great concern that we could not identify recharge as a beneficial use. And there was question that those water rights might be not available to them because capturing that water would not be available. Other consequences, sure, there could be. I'd have to understand it a little more.
Yeah, and I think
I might follow up with you on that offline.
Yeah, and I think what we'll do is maybe connect Eric with you to kind of touch bases on that, because it's interesting that it's out there. I mean, it's interesting. It continues to be an issue, and we don't. I mean, it's yeah.
I think the real question comes back to, I'll say this discussion on. I hate to even use floodwater, but unused water that's under a water right, is that going to be called into question? Right. And recharge is going to be a critical, important use for all areas that have access to a water supply.
Question on number 2 of the suggestions for help on the operational flexibility. I really agree with that. We have issues every year with transfers, and the system is probably getting better, but how do we finally get to where we have that flexibility? I mean, what suggestions do you have? You know, we heard the commissioner speak on the federal supply side that, well, it's 20%, but they're going to reevaluate it And so people south of the Delta are trying to figure out, well, how much water do I need to try to buy? People north of the Delta are trying to figure out, well, do we sell water? And, you know, you've got this regulatory process that you have to go through, and it's only April, whatever today is, 2nd or 3rd. And, you know, what are your suggestions to streamline it or just make it timely so that you know, we can do this in an expeditious manner? The same stuff happens every year, but why is it so difficult?
Well, I'll get you a list. I am not as directly involved with State Water Project water, only locally on CVP water, but I have several in our office that do, and I know they have been putting those suggestions forth on how do we streamline the environmental process, the approval process, especially for, and I know there have been some efforts, but why does it take so long? Is there dedicated staff that could be needed? Are there more resources needed for the approval process? I think all options should be considered. I would add not just moving water out, because we're adding another level of approval essentially with these GSAs being added in. We already have groundwater ordinances in a lot of counties on where water can be moved, so we're adding another level. And I think Jason was talking about the operational flexibility at the grower level, and we would see that. I didn't put a slide up today. We've presented to DWR. We're working through how will we set the thresholds for where a minimum threshold will be, and really it's where's our measurable objective. So if you can picture a hydrograph of wells dropping, where we set the bar of where we think we will be sustainable, you'll be up and down around it, but you're still going to be at a flat line eventually. How we set that is where a lot of effort's being spent right now, and in some areas it's easier than others, but that operational flexibility in the GSA really becomes, okay, here's my flat line, but what sort of a fluctuation do I need to account for? And that's where I think we really want to err conservatively now. One of the proposals we're looking at is, okay, we just had a historic drought. What did the water table do at these wells, and allow for that level of fluctuation? Can we handle that, and what are the implications to our neighbors? So I think we can do it in one basin, but how does that apply in the others? That's another part of the operational flexibility we want to add in, besides the ability to move water around as needed.
It's a new one.
Let me get Bryce.
Ron, you know, in your remarks, you mentioned that this sigma was misnamed. I kind of took that to mean you maybe were expressing frustration with the act, but maybe I misinterpreted that it's just misnamed, not that we didn't need it.
No, I didn't mean, I just meant that I think people looked at it as, oh, it's just going to regulate groundwater, but in reality, the impacts of regulating groundwater affect our whole water supply.
Very good. Ron, you've begun some of your remarks with the idea that everybody is just going to cut 0.2, and we'll get to that 200,000. That's easy done, but I imagine you've got a much more complex thing going on, and as it's necessary. From a, you mentioned when you leave that year so that you can get approval, agreement, and then you've got a budget to cover. Is everybody going to get charged the same amount to implement the groundwater sustainability plan? Just for instance, if you had 50% surface water users and 50% groundwater users, I'm thinking the overdraft is caused by the groundwater users. Those are the projects you need. Are the surface water users going to get charged the same, or how would you handle that? Give me your thoughts on how the charges get allocated.
Well, I guess I can punt a little bit and say that's up for the boards to decide eventually. That is the question everyone wants to know. What is it going to be? I don't see a situation where it's going to be the same across the board. Looking at the Kings, we have 7 GSAs preparing 7 different GSPs. Within each GSA, a couple of them are essentially irrigation districts, Central and James. A couple of the others, North Kings, North Fork, There are 7, 8, 10, 12 agencies comprise that, including white areas, and that we know across the state. So each GSA is ultimately going to determine how that GSA pays for those sets of projects. As a ratepayer at my house, I don't anticipate to pay the same. I do pay actually for a little bit of surface water that goes to the city, and I don't anticipate to pay the same amount that someone who isn't paying for that. So I think most areas are looking at how credit will be given for the amount already being contributed for surface water to correct the overdraft.
We're gonna have to wrap it up. We have another presenter after you, Ron. If you want to hang around for a little while, I know we have other questions for you.
Okay.
I appreciate it. If you need to run, we understand too. Okay, excellent. We're going to move on to Christina Babbitt. Christina, welcome. Christina manages the California Groundwater Program at Environmental Defense Fund. The California Groundwater Program is working to reform water transfer policy in California and to launch replicable groundwater sustainability pilot projects across California's Central Valley. So welcome.
Thank you very much for the introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here today and to be able to share a little bit about the groundwater work we're doing in California. I've also been asked to share a few thoughts on the... Oh. Is that better? Okay. And I've also been asked to talk a little bit about our perspective on current water issues, and I think there'll definitely be some themes in what you guys hear today. So for my presentation today, I'm going to give just a very brief overview of the Environmental Defense Fund for those of you who might not be as familiar with the organization. I'm going to talk about water issues for the current year, and this is definitely going to be through a Sigma lens. That's where I spend most of my time focusing. And then I'll dive into some of the work that we're doing in our California Groundwater Program. So the Environmental Defense Fund is one of the world's largest environmental nonprofit organizations. We have offices across the globe. We have more than 700 staff, scientists, engineers, policymakers, and attorneys working for us. We have over 2 million members, and we really focus on how we can forge solutions that allow people and nature to prosper. Across our organization, we focus on climate and energy. We focus on oceans, health, and ecosystems is where our Western water work is housed. It's also where my colleague Eric Holst works as he leads our Working Lands program. So for our Western water work, we focus across 3 geographies, the upper and lower Colorado River Basin and here in California. We work primarily in areas that are dominated by irrigated agriculture. As I mentioned, I'll focus my talk today on California. I'll begin with sharing some of the issues that we see, and that really shapes some of the work we do here on the ground. So a theme for sure is groundwater sustainability planning. I think we had a big milestone with all of the GSAs actually forming. I think there's over 280 of them. And now I think people are really getting to work on what their groundwater sustainability plans will look like. I think early on there's been a lot of talk about different supply augmentation strategies that can be employed, and that will definitely be a key piece of the puzzle. I think the work on groundwater recharge and groundwater storage, that has definitely been a theme in the conversation today, is hugely important. The work that Ashley Boren is doing with sustainable conservation with Mr. Cameron is hugely important to show people ways forward. I think we're also going to need other strategies as well. So you've heard a little bit about groundwater trading and the role that groundwater trading can play. And I think that offers a lot of promise if designed in the right way. I think when you think about issues, and we at EDF think a lot about the role that water trading or markets can play in generally to achieve better outcomes. When it comes to water, I think one of the issues that we're working through right now in California is how do you do allocations? How do you do groundwater allocations, and what does that look like? And that's playing out for sure on the ground, and I'll touch a little more on that as I talk about some of the work that we're doing. Also, coordination between GSAs, 280 plus GSAs, 127 basins. If you're within a basin, you can either choose to do one groundwater sustainability plan, or you can have multiple groundwater sustainability plans for each agency, but you have to stay coordinated. So what that coordination means is that you have to use similar methodologies and data. And so I think we're going to see some tensions as those data and methodologies are reconciled. So it'll be really important to open up avenues of communication across different agencies. It's also been mentioned landscape changes under SGMA. There's some estimates that up to 500,000 acres of irrigated land in the San Joaquin could go fallow under SGMA and come out of production due to reduced groundwater pumping. That obviously has huge implications for the agricultural economy, and it also has implications in how that land is managed, if you're managing for invasive species or dust control for health effects. And then public engagement. This is the last one that I'll touch on, but I think it's going to be really important to involve stakeholders in the process. I think building trust between these groups, SGMA is something that is new. People have not worked together. They don't have the relationships. So building trust from the earliest stages of program development is going to be key. And I've been really impressed with some of the work that I've seen with Jack Rice and the Farm Bureau, the Community Water Center, some irrigation districts and GSAs on the ground, Turlock Irrigation District, Sonoma. They have all done really good work, but we really need models to show how folks can get these groups involved. So with that, it really sets some of the context for the work that we're doing at EDF. We focus on three main work streams: advancing sustainable groundwater management. So how can we better manage surface and groundwater in an interconnected fashion so we're not always using groundwater as an escape hatch during times of drought? This also means thinking about how we can develop resources and tools, either through EDF or in partnership, to support action on the ground. How can we help people achieve better outcomes? And then also focusing on creating healthy water trading programs, not just how we can have better environmental or economic outcomes, but also how we can design these water trading programs in ways that benefit the communities and the environment as well. And thirdly, planning for resilient ecosystems and communities. And this is some of the work that we're doing to see how we can incentivize, for example, habitat improvements on agricultural lands. So with that, I'll touch on each of these three work streams just by highlighting a few of the projects that we're doing. I'm definitely not going to go deep into any of these or cover all of our work, but happy to discuss any of these more in the Q&A session. So the first one, earlier this year, we released our report with the Water for Food Global Institute out of the University of Nebraska. And we looked at 6 Western states, 9 case studies to see how other areas are managing groundwater. And we really wanted this report to be informative to SGMA, so we looked at how they're addressing the 6 undesirable results. And so obviously states across the West are dealing with surface water or groundwater declines, degraded water quality, land subsidence, and we really wanted to think more about the context in which these solutions are being implemented. So what is the political context? What is the social context these solutions are working? And we looked at regulations, we looked at incentive-based mechanisms, we also looked at supply augmentation strategies, as well as education and outreach tools. And really what we found, all the case studies are detailed in the report, but if you looked across case studies, kind of the 5 components for successful water management really are things like building trust, having a portfolio of approaches, performance metrics to be able to gauge how you're doing, having data, and having funding. And these are all themes that you've heard brought up today. Also, we're working on supporting implementation of a website called the Groundwater Exchange. And this is a project that EDF is helping facilitate in partnership with Stanford's Water in the West and the California Groundwater Library, a project of Maven's Notebook. And really the idea behind this website is that there's so many different academic groups, NGO groups, agencies on the ground working to develop resources and tools to support SGMA implementation. But the folks on the ground don't necessarily have the time or the capacity to go from one website to another trying to find these resources. So we've had many, many scoping meetings, many conversations, workshops to actually learn more about what the need for folks on the ground is, and then how this information can best be organized. And so this website will launch in August of 2018, and it will include right now 3 main components. It will include a searchable data library for data and tools with a map interface. It will have a new to Sigma section for those interested in learning more about the legislation. And it will also have a forum to connect groundwaters on the ground who are struggling to address similar challenges. I think building that network is really going to be key. So now I'm going to transition to creating healthy water programs. So last year we conducted a series of legal and technical workshops in addition to over 24 interviews with experts on the ground in California to learn more about the role that water trading can play. And we partnered with Mammoth Trading to develop this white paper. And it kind of serves to demystify trading programs. So what are the different components of a groundwater trading program? How could these programs apply under Sigma? And also, what are these unanswered questions that people are going to be struggling with? Because it's not necessarily clear cut. And then I think one of the themes that came out of that is, as I mentioned before, the idea of groundwater allocations. Groundwater sustainability agencies have the ability to manage groundwater, but they don't necessarily have the authority to change any groundwater rights. So how does that play out when you're dealing with allocations? So that's something we're diving into deeper right now, working on what kind of guidance can we provide to GSAs as they think through some of these issues. And that should come out in the next several months. And then also, how can we demonstrate groundwater trading programs on the ground? I think right now a lot of folks are just starting to explore the concept and what that might mean for them and helping them achieve their goals under Sigma. So we're talking with people about the possibilities of creating simulations or working groups around the topics, or even possibly demonstrating on the ground. And so the last topic I'll cover is planning for a resilient San Joaquin Valley. So I mentioned the potential land use changes in the San Joaquin Valley under Sigma, and we really want to be proactive in how we think about those things. Building off the work of EDF's Central Valley Habitat Exchange, we're thinking about how we can pay farmers to restore some of their land to provide habitat for species like the kit fox or the monarch butterfly. How can we create these additional revenue streams for folks on the ground? In addition to that, we're also trying to learn more about what this potential demand for habitat is. We're conducting analysis right now to look at what are the state and federal funding sources, what are the mitigation funding sources that might be available. And then thirdly, we're also looking at if we have partners and farmers willing to engage in these types of programs, how can we investigate a multi-species safe harbor agreement so that they don't then have to suffer any repercussions of regulatory actions after they put in these programs. So with that, it was a bit of a whirlwind. I had 12 to 15 minutes, so I tried to cover a lot. But I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
So I do have a question, and this is jumping ahead a bit, but we do know that there's a very strong possibility and a likelihood of fallowed land. And I know that some of the folks in the valley are already looking ahead at the land use implications of that and thinking through some creative ways of still retaining some value for that land and jobs that might come from a rezoning or something like that. Have you put some thought into, we don't want bare land, and certainly habitat is one way of using that, but are there some other things you've been thinking about specific to land that's been very productive, is a big asset on the books, and if it gets disconnected from the water, what else is possible with that?
Yeah, very good question. I think it's one people are starting to think a lot about. I think it's about being strategic. If lands have to come out of production, how can you then best use land? How can you manage it for habitat value? Or maybe you could manage it for recharge facilities, or what are the co-benefits? Maybe there's a wildlife corridor nearby, and then you would have an ability to do something there. So I think there is a reality that some land will come out of production, but it's about being strategic and thinking about these multiple co-benefits and how you move forward from there.
I'm going to jump ahead of you, too. Sorry, Don. You know, Christina, you talked about 500,000 acres potentially being idled. Have you done any research on the jobs lost, the community, the small communities that are going to maybe devastated due to this? Yeah, I guess the social and economic implications of Sigma on some of these areas? Because I think it's going to be pretty severe in some areas.
Yeah. So the number that I cited came out from I think it was a 2017 Public Policy Institute of California report. And so that looks at kind of the future of the San Joaquin Valley. So I would assume that PPIC would be a great place to look at for some of those numbers. But I specifically haven't, but I think it goes without saying that there's going to be huge ripple effects throughout because of that.
I wanted to go back to Karen's question. You know, when we're a CVP contractor and a water right holder, and when we transfer water in fallow ground, we have to absolutely fallow the ground. We actually have to go back and disc up weeds that might grow because they consumptively use water, or at least in the mind of the Bureau. So when, you know, it's something for you to think about when you work through this, that, you know, it'd be nice to grow habitat on that fallow ground, but we're not allowed to do that. In fact, they come out in July and they virtually look at every single field to make sure it's weed-free or just vegetation-free.
Yeah.
And that's not good use of the land for a lot of reasons. But you know, so that's something that really needs to be addressed and worked through.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, there's wonderful habitat out there that would benefit a lot of species, but bare ground doesn't benefit much of anything.
Yeah, I 100% agree and appreciate the comment. I mean, I think it also, you also have to consider if you're putting in vegetation, what are the water demand requirements? So I think it is about looking at the holistic picture and what you're ultimately trying to accomplish. But I mean, I think, you know, we want to accomplish good, you know, strong economies and communities and ecosystems. So what does that look like when you look at the bigger picture?
Mostly, I was just going to say, you know, I was wrong when I mentioned to Ron that there was $500 million in the water bond for Sigma. It's 675. Yeah, 675 million. And so for funding there, that is a nice pool of funds. November 2018 ballot.
I'm glad it wasn't a hard question directed towards me, so thank you. Yeah.
Well, you know, if you want to hear me plug it really hard, Jerry and I are going to spend the day in Placer County on April 10th. Very good. Well, you could carpool with me if you want.
I just wanted to ask a follow-up to Dawn. Although first I wanted to say, Christina, how much I admire your organization. And particularly its staff, high-quality staff. Really smart people, yeah. But recognizing, Dawn, that you're not the proponent of this BLM monitoring, or not BLM, but Bureau of Reclamation monitoring. Have you asked them the logical connection between the hydrological connection between the weed in your field and the water you've transferred? Is it just in the basin?
There's seepage of water and it's growing the weeds. And you have drains.
Yeah.
And those drains take up water and that water can move. And I don't know if anybody's measured how much water it is, but it's like.
And what's the penalty if they find a weed?
You forfeit your transfer money.
The whole thing?
You know, I can't answer that, but it would be it would be that particular field. So if it's a 100-acre field, you know, 3.3 acre feet times 100 times whatever.
Maybe this is an idea we could explore, which is just some kind of a reasonable rate. So if you decided to vegetate your field rather than forfeiting the whole payment, you could calculate the water use and just deduct that as opposed to losing the whole thing. Yeah, exactly.
That's right.
Some kind of crediting system, because that seems a little perverse.
You know, I mean, some of the vegetation grows because you have a rain in June. Right. So is that coming, but if it rains in June, then you're out disking everything because you're gonna have vegetation everywhere.
And you're paying for fuel and burning fuel and adding to the greenhouse gases and whatnot. So that's, yeah, exactly.
It's, to me, a real challenge to do what Dawn is suggesting there. And Dawn, you're exactly right, that happens, but the state doesn't bring it doesn't give any value to the habitat that ground could have if you were able to leave some of that vegetation that might be a foot tall or a foot and a half tall for birds or small animals or things like that. And so it's very much a siloed type of approach, isn't it?
So I wasn't offered the ability to like request things, but that might be one of my requests is to think more about, how we can achieve these co-benefits or the habitat benefits, and then reward people for doing good things on their land.
Well, if there's not another question, I do have to, I mean, you said it, the Center for Food and Water at the University of Nebraska?
The
What's
Water
with
for
that?
Food Global Institute at the University of Nebraska.
I'm very familiar with it.
Yeah. I know you're a Husker.
So everybody's getting their plug in today. So yeah.
I should have worn my Nebraska pin. I actually went to school at the University of Nebraska.
Okay. Do we have any other questions or plugs for
Fading
your?
fast.
No, yeah, we're not going back, bro. So Christina, thank you very much.
Very much.
Appreciate your
it.
presentation. And great organization, right? So at this point, Karen, you want to give a departmental update? Secretary Ross will give us the department update.
I will be brief. We continue to work our way through the situation that we're in with the judge's ruling on the programmatic environmental impact report for our pest programs and looking at other options under CEQA to be in compliance and still manage these programs. The most urgent one, of course, is Wanglong Bing and the Asian citrus psyllid. And so we continue to work our way through that. And in fact, at 3 o'clock, I have 2 back-to-back meetings on that. So it continues to be a big issue. There's still not a lot of answers for that, but it is the highest priority. And we have filed the notice of our intent to appeal, but the brief has not yet been filed on that. So I just wanted to make sure that you were aware of that. Early this month, I saw a couple movies that I want to recommend to folks. One of them is Beyond the Brink, which I had forgotten was being filmed when I was interviewed over a year and a half ago. And that was shown a couple of weeks ago in connection with the Aqua Ledge Day. And it was, the view of the producer of this one was to really try to connect water used in agriculture for food security and national security. And he had a couple of things from South Africa. He has some connections there. But it was fairly, I thought it was well done. So if you have a chance to see it, I would suggest that to you. The other one was on Ag Day, and it was sponsored by the Center for Land-Based Learning, producer out of New York who produced a movie called Farmers for America, and is talking about the next generation of farmers, how desperately they're needed, what the challenges are, and specifically to your point, Mr. Chairman, he did a great job talking about where I come from, and that is what happens when farmers leave the land, or there's so much consolidation, how directly that's connected to the woes of Main Street and churches and schools and rural communities. It's very well done. And there were 2 farmers in the film from California. I will have to say it was pretty Midwest-centric, but so be it. That's where everybody thinks farming happens. So well, I actually put a plug on my blog last week for communities. He is doing his, he's one of the millennials that's very entrepreneurial, and so it's being shown when there's requests to do it in connection with sponsoring a fundraiser or something, and so you contact him if you want to have a community viewing. Yeah, but I do recommend it. I think it tells that story. It was an hour and maybe 10 minutes max. Yeah, it moves along. He did a good job with that. We've had lots of ledge days around here. I do want to mention the San Joaquin Valley Partnership. It celebrated its 10th year last year. Our most recent meeting was in Merced 2 weeks ago. And here's kudos to UC Merced. Everything that people said would happen when you put a university in the valley is really starting to happen. And the thing about it is that it's not just about UC Merced and the extraordinary developments that are happening around that and how they are doubling the size of their campus with an unusual public-private partnership financing mechanism. But the engineers and the construction crews are all offering jobs and internships, so they're also making a real-world experience of students who are living on campus. They're going to double the footprint of that campus, and they will be 10,000 students in just a short period of time, with doing a lot of really extraordinary accomplishments with that. But what's also been good about the San Joaquin Valley Partnership and how the education system in the valley is working, it's K through 12, community colleges, CSU, and UC up and down the valley, and they're doing a lot of good things, and it's definitely worth highlighting. Had a very successful Ag Day last week. We had rain, and then we had a break in the rain, and then we had rain again. But we had huge audience, lots of people participating and enjoying that. And that afternoon, we hosted the Imagine This, which is the writing contest that is sponsored by Ag in the Classroom, 1st through 8th graders that compete on a statewide basis, and one story is selected for each class. And the authors come and read it, and they autograph the books to hand out at Ag Day. And the cool part is that there are a number of high schools of participating art departments. And so the winning story is sent to that art department, and the students illustrate it. And on the day of the awards ceremony, the high school students get to meet the author. And it's very, very, very cool. Yes, so if you ever have a chance to participate in that, please do. And Ag in the Classroom sponsored their first Sacramento Farm Comes to the City event on last Friday. And they had a very unusual partner in sponsoring that. Coach Dave Yeager, who's the Kings coach. I didn't know at the time, but I met him. But it was a great event. His foundation is dedicated to providing experiences for students in some of the underserved communities to have experiences they would not otherwise have. And when he heard about bringing the farm to the city, he knew that's something he wanted to do. He grew up in rural Minnesota, and his wife is from rural South Dakota. And it was wonderful. 1,500 students, over 200 volunteers, all different kinds of booths and experiences. It was very much learn by doing. Do you know anything about that, Dean? Huh? It's a good slogan. Somebody should use that for their school, don't you think? Yeah, so there's a lot of really, really great things going on. And Ashley, I don't know if we got to a conclusion on Plant Right, but we've been doing a lot of work on native plants and biodiversity as part of climate change. There's a lot of work going on with that right now. And then yesterday, even though it's April, I'm going to tell you about yesterday. This is my 3rd time of going down to Disneyland, specifically to visit California Adventure. It's the 3rd year of them bringing back their Food and Wine Festival. And this is the first 2 were Carolyn Bettetta, my partner in crime from Visit California, and me on behalf of California Grown, working with them to feature California Grown. And this year, it's there, and the signage is awesome. The content that goes with all the food kiosks is awesome. People love the diversity of food that's there. They're learning about agriculture. And we did this event yesterday with the Wine Institute and the Sustainable Wine Growing Alliance, because it's the 15th year of the Sustainable Wine Growing Program and the certification program. It is terrific. And so Carolyn and I, all the way back, were like little baby steps of really showing people what we can do together. But if you think about how many bodies will go through that park and see everything about California Grown and the facts and the figures and the 15 commodities that decided to participate in that, there's so many opportunities to do that. So I just wanted to end that on a very high note. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Ross. At this time, do we have any other discussion we need to go through? Don, go ahead.
Karen, on the litigation, you know, this has huge implications. So, I mean, does this at some point become a political issue where you say, I can't go any further, or can you push this as far as you need to push it?
We need to follow this legal route. I think a real potential focal point for us to think about is if the appeal is not successful, and how many options we have under CEQA, because we want to do everything possible, obviously, to comply with CEQA. So we still have a ways to go on that, but it is huge. It has huge implications for many programs. It does. And sitting next to our favorite dairymen on the state board, if people didn't see the news, USDA did publish their final proposal on a federal milk marketing order for California that was published on Monday. Oh, no, last Monday. And it's now in referendum mode for producers to vote. That vote is supposed to close on May 5th. There will be public workshops, one in Modesto and one in Clovis. The Clovis one is for producers, and that will be on April 10th of next week. So they're proceeding very quickly. So it's out of our hands for now. It's in the hands of the producers. Oh, on the public, yeah, I think I reported at the last meeting that originally he granted an injunction to stop all of our pest detection, management, control, and eradication projects. That was narrowed to stopping any state application of pesticides for eradication. So it still has implications for some of the control programs and other things that we're doing, but at least we can continue with border stations, trapping, detection, and all those kinds of things.
Who brought suit, Karen?
The primary plaintiffs were the Environmental Working Group, the Center for Biological Diversity, and the Moms. Moms was an organization that was created during the light brown apple moth. Moms, I wish I could remember that. I can't remember. And then there's one North Coast group that I can't remember.
Good, Annie.
Well, once our brief is filed on the appeal at the Superior Court, those usually move forward very rapidly, so we'll know about that fairly soon. And if an appeal is granted, the full case can take years.
So no spraying until that is.
We have some options, including where there's merit for it, declaring emergency and going through the notification process, public workshop process. We're still doing a number of, because we have a number of programs at different life cycle stages, we're still doing very thorough life cycle stages to see and prioritize which ones might have to go forward. Very aware.
Martha?
I'm sorry I'm going to bother again, but it's taking me 15 years to finally get this CRA go to rural areas. Literally 15 years, Karen, that I've been bugging the chairman of the Federal Reserve, and everybody in between, FDIC, and all. Joseph Oding is the new comptroller of the currency. I have his business card, and he comes from California. He loves California. Though he was born Midwest, he's a Californian by heading Union Bank and Bank of America, etc. And he inherited what already was in motion for CRA hearings. And I was just mentioning that, for example, CASA has 20 hearings. The other one's 10, 15. California has 2 hearings and happen to be only in Pasadena and Arcadia. So no rural hearings at all. Though we have been, California delegations, the one pushing the most for this. I like to make sure that we engage a little bit more in the next couple of weeks or month maximum, because this is when we can make comments for changes on the CRA, the Community Reinvestment Bank, into rural areas. And mostly tend to be everybody but us, Department of Agriculture, because we don't connect the financials with the rural areas. And so banks, literally I walked 3 days, Washington, D.C., and everywhere I went, everybody's understanding that food and lack of food in 2050 is going to really impact everyone worldwide, especially USA. And so now everything is in motion. And because Mr. President has decided that he was going to go most into rural areas, that's why he's pushing everything more, but we are not on the table, at the table as California. So I want to, Joseph said, Marta, we had an amazing dinners together. Make sure that you guys get engaged. So I want to invite you, and I'll give you the business card. You can pick up the phone, call, talk with him. I'll volunteer to do whatever needs to be done, but I think 15 years later, finally we can get this moving after Bernanke was the one who kind of started this motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Martha. Before we adjourn, we had a full day of water and SGMA, and what I'd like to do is maybe reconvene our water committee and maybe get some recommendations put together that we can pass on to the Secretary and the Governor on how we can move forward and maybe help alleviate some of the issues that the growers are facing throughout California. So, Josh, I charge you with putting everybody together and see if we can do something within the next 3 weeks before the next meeting. So, if we have nothing else,
Public comment.
Gosh, thank you.
Michael, you weren't going to let us adjourn, were you?
Sorry, Michael. Public comment.
No, it's great news. Actually, I was really excited. I was in another meeting over at the Capitol, and they're putting some new proposed regulations into engaging in how the police engage, to preserve the sanctity of life. And I was really happy to hear the comments of the speakers of the, I won't say drought conditions, lack of adequate water in South Africa, having an intentional conversation at the end about how it's impacting black farmers. And so I was happy to hear that. So what's happening at the end of the month is the president of Ghana will be here, and I'm continuing to work with Dr. Ernest Uwazi over at the Center of Peace and Conflict Resolution at Sac State to encourage him to look at agriculture a little deeper as a way to engage the reduction of conflicts in Africa. It's a political thing primarily, but he's entertaining it. So I should have some good news, hopefully by the end of this week, on how we can increase exchange with California agriculture with the broader parts of Africa that really need it. Up on the other side of Lake Volta in Ghana is a beautiful area. Out there, Afrim Valley, they could use some technology. Rick Jennings with the students, what would he call it? Farm to the City. Rick, he was excited about it, and I said, well, you might want to connect it to the broader CDFA and come to the board, and he was excited, that I have been engaged so long. He said, well, make it happen. So I said, well, okay. So the idea that urban agriculture continues to be a passion, but it's kind of ironic that the African Consortium, some serious, engineers and architects, the MOAD in San Francisco, and I don't know if you've met Fred Jordan. He's the president of the San Francisco Chamber of Commerce, and we've been engaged him with a project out here at Carson Creek, repurposing the food into a food and ag center, the old Boys Ranch, 150 acres. He says, well, Michael, we have 50,000 acres in Nigeria. And I said, okay, well, just set aside 150. We'll just duplicate what we do in California and in Nigeria. So hopefully all of this will come together. Farm to Fork Friday on the 27th, while the president of Ghana, Nana Adodo, I believe that's how you say it, as well as a couple of governors, I believe in Nigeria and maybe Sierra Leone. I have to get the final schedule from Dr. Uwazi, but I will definitely, Josh, send it to you. And it can be and should be a big thing. The president of the first independent country in Africa, Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah said that there's no freedom in Africa unless all the states are free, and now there's an Africa Union moving towards one economic currency. It's already, reducing the borders with the current chair of the Africa Union, Paul Kagame, and these are some forward-thinking people. When I was born, they set up this idea of one Africa, and I got some whiskers on me, and it's finally here. So I thank you all for your patience, and it's been a few years since I've seen and known most of you, and I don't have to do no screaming and shouting no more. It's a beautiful thing, beautiful day.
Thank you, Michael. Okay, our meeting is concluded.